The dust of the Wyoming Territory settled on Sarah Vance's boots as she stood at the threshold of her small homestead, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun cast its dying light. For 3 years, she had kept her vigil at this same door, waiting for the return of a husband who had ridden off to seek his fortune in the gold fields of Montana, promising to return before the first snow. 3 winters had come and gone, and still Sarah waited. The year was 1876, and Helena, Montana Territory, had transformed from a mining camp to a bustling town in the time since James had left. Sarah had received exactly 6 letters in the first year, 3 in the second, and none since. The last had spoken of rich claims and promises of a grand future. It bore a Helena postmark and contained $5, a paltry sum that did little to sustain her on the homestead they had built together. Sarah swept the porch, as she did every evening, her routine unchanged, despite the neighbors' pitying glances when they passed. At 23, her youth was slipping away in this daily ritual of waiting. "Still standing guard, Miss Sarah?" The familiar voice of Mrs. Abernathy, her nearest neighbor at a quarter-mile distant, cut through the evening air. Sarah straightened her back. "Just enjoying the sunset, Mrs. Abernathy." The older woman's face creased with concern. "The Sullivan Ranch is looking for help with their spring cleaning. Thought you might be interested. Can't live on that garden alone, dear." "I'll think on it," Sarah replied, though both knew she would decline, as she had all offers that would take her away from her post. Mrs. Abernathy shook her head and continued down the dirt road, her wagon creaking in the silence of the prairie. Inside, Sarah lit a lamp and prepared a simple supper of beans and the last of her bread. The cabin, once filled with the laughter and dreams of newlyweds, echoed with emptiness. She ate at the table James had crafted with his own hands, staring at his empty chair. After washing her dish, Sarah took out James's letters, read each one carefully as she did most nights, then placed them back in the cedar box he had given her as a wedding gift. She would sleep and rise with the sun, beginning her wait anew. Miles away, in a saloon in Helena, a man named Samuel Dawson pushed away from a poker table, his winnings modest but enough. At 30, his face bore the marks of a hard life lived mostly outdoors, weathered skin, lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting in the sun, and a perpetual alertness that came from years of watching horizons and men's hands alike. "Turning in early, Dawson?" asked the dealer, a man with fingers stained yellow from tobacco. "Got an early start tomorrow," Sam replied, tucking his money into his vest pocket. "Cattle drive coming through. Crawford's hired me to help bring 'em in." The dealer nodded. Sam had a reputation as a reliable hand, one who didn't drink to excess and could be trusted to show up when promised. Such men were valuable in the West. Sam stepped out into the cool night air of Helena, a town that had sprung up around Last Chance Gulch, where gold had been discovered in 1864. The city had grown rapidly, its streets now lined with businesses and homes more substantial than the tents and shacks of its early days. Yet it still retained the rawness of a frontier settlement. He walked to his lodgings, a small room above the livery. Sleep would be short. Dawn would find him in the saddle, headed south to meet the Crawford herd coming up from Colorado Territory. The next morning, as promised, Sam rode out of Helena before the town had fully awakened. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Buck, moved with the easy gait of an animal accustomed to long journeys. The landscape stretched before him, vast and beautiful in its harsh way. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks still snow-capped even as spring took hold in the valleys. Sam had been all over the Western Territories since leaving home in Pennsylvania at 18. He had driven cattle, hunted buffalo for the railroads, and even tried his hand at prospecting, but nothing had given him roots. He met the Crawford drive 2 days south of Helena. 20 cowboys, 300 head of cattle, and the trail boss, a gruff man named Jenkins. "Dawson," Jenkins greeted him with a nod. "Crawford says you know the territory." "Well enough," Sam confirmed. "There's water at Miller's Creek about 10 miles ahead. Good spot to bed down the herd for the night." Jenkins nodded, and Sam fell into place with the other men, riding flank to keep the cattle from straying. The work was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. The cattle moved at their steady pace, the cowboys called to one another, and the day passed in a rhythm as old as the West itself. As predicted, they reached Miller's Creek by late afternoon. The cattle were watered and settled, the chuck wagon produced a hearty meal, and the men gathered around the fire as night descended. "Heard there's a widow down near Cheyenne," one of the younger cowboys was saying. "Waits at her door every day for her man to return. Been doing it for years." "Fool woman," another commented. "Man's probably long dead or run off with another." "Some women don't know when to let go," a third added. Sam sipped his coffee, listening but not commenting. He had seen his share of grief and loss, of people holding on to hopes that had died long before they were willing to admit it. "What about you, Dawson?" Jenkins asked, noticing his silence. "You ever had a woman waiting on you?" Sam shook his head. "Never stayed in one place long enough." "Smart man," Jenkins replied, raising his cup in a mock toast. But that night, as Sam lay under the stars, he thought about the widow near Cheyenne. There was something both sad and admirable about such devotion. He wondered what kind of man would leave a woman who loved him that deeply and never return. The cattle drive continued northward, the days blending into one another with the monotony of the trail. A week in, they encountered a problem. A bridge they needed to cross had been washed out in the spring floods, forcing them to find another route. "There's a ford about 20 miles east," Sam suggested to Jenkins. "It'll add 3 days to the journey, but it's safer than trying to swim the herd across." Jenkins considered this. "Crawford won't like the delay." "Crawford would like losing a third of his herd even less," Sam pointed out. The trail boss conceded with a grunt, and they changed course. The detour took them through territory Sam hadn't traversed in years. On the second day, they came upon a small homestead set back from the trail. A woman stood at the door, shading her eyes against the sun as she watched their approach. Jenkins rode ahead to ask permission to water the herd at the stream that cut through her property. Sam stayed with the cattle, but his eyes were drawn to the woman. She was young, or younger than she first appeared, with her hair pulled back severely and her dress faded from many washings. When Jenkins returned, he brought news. "Name's Sarah Vance. Husband went to the gold fields 3 years back, never returned. She's agreed to let us water the herd and camp on her land tonight. Says we can slaughter one of our beeves for supper if we share with her." Sam nodded, helping to direct the cattle toward the stream. Throughout the process, he noticed the woman Sarah watching from her doorway, never venturing far from the threshold. As evening approached, Sam was assigned to butcher the steer they'd selected for dinner. He worked efficiently, and when he delivered a portion of the meat to Sarah's door, he got his first good look at her. Her eyes were the deep blue of a mountain lake, striking against her sun-browned skin. There was a wariness in them, but also a quiet strength. "Thank you," she said, taking the package wrapped in cloth. "It's been some time since I've had fresh beef." "It's the least we can do for your hospitality." "Madam," Sam replied, removing his hat. "Samuel Dawson." "Sarah Vance," she responded, though he already knew her name. "Will you be moving on tomorrow?" "That's the plan. Need to make Helena by month's end." Something flickered in her eyes at the mention of Helena. My husband. He went to Helena. For the gold. Sam had seen enough mining towns to know the odds. For every man who struck it rich, hundreds found nothing but hardship. "Been there long?" 3 years this past February." She held herself a little straighter. "He'll be back." The certainty in her voice gave Sam pause. He had assumed she was a widow, but she spoke as if her husband were merely delayed, not gone forever. "I'm sure he will," Sam said, not believing it for a moment, but unwilling to be the one to shatter her hope. Sarah seemed to sense his doubt. "You think I'm foolish?" "Not foolish, madam. Loyal." She studied him for a moment, then nodded, accepting his answer. "Your supper will get cold." Sam replaced his hat and returned to the camp, where the men were already eating. He found himself glancing back at the homestead, where Sarah had retreated inside, but left her door open as if in perpetual readiness for a return that seemed increasingly unlikely. After supper, as the men settled in for the night, Sam approached Jenkins. "Mind if I look in on the widow's place tomorrow before we leave? She might need some repairs done. Seems she's been managing alone for quite a while." Jenkins eyed him knowingly. "Got a soft spot for strays, Dawson?" Sam shrugged. "Just offering a hand." "We can spare an hour or two after dawn," Jenkins conceded, "but no more. We're already behind schedule." The next morning, Sam rose before the others and walked the perimeter of Sarah's property. The place was well maintained for someone living alone, but he noted several areas that needed attention: a loose board on the barn, a section of fence that had begun to lean, a shutter hanging by a single hinge. When Sarah emerged from the cabin, she seemed surprised to find him there. "Mr. Dawson? Is something wrong?" "No, madam. Just thought I might help with a few repairs before we head out, if you're amenable." She hesitated, glancing at the door as if afraid to be away from it too long. "I couldn't ask you to do that." "You didn't ask. I offered." He gestured to the barn. "That board could come loose in the next strong wind. Wouldn't take but a few minutes to secure it." Sarah looked torn, but finally nodded. "There are tools in the barn, my husband's." Sam found the tools where she indicated, well oiled and cared for despite years of disuse. He worked quickly, aware of Jenkins's time constraint, and Sarah watched from a distance, never straying far from the cabin. As he hammered the last nail into the repaired shutter, he ventured a question. "Your husband, what's his name?" "James," she replied. "James Vance." "And he went to Helena for the gold?" She nodded. "He had plans to stake a claim, work it until it paid, then come back for me. His last letter said he was close, that the next one would contain enough money for me to join him." Her voice faltered slightly. "That was 1.5 years ago." Sam wiped his hands on a rag. "A lot of men tried their luck in those hills." "And many succeeded," she countered, a hint of defiance in her tone. "Yes, madam, they did." He returned the tools to their place in the barn. "Helena's grown since the early days. It's a proper city now." "Have you been there recently?" "Just left yesterday. That's where Crawford hired me for this drive." Sarah's eyes lit with interest. "Perhaps you've heard of James? He would stand out tall, with red hair and a laugh that fills a room." Sam had met hundreds of men in Helena, but none that matched that description who was waiting for a wife on a homestead. "Can't say I have, madam, but Helena's a big place now." Her hope visibly dimmed. "Yes, of course." In the distance, Jenkins whistled, signaling it was time to move out. "I should go," Sam said. "Thank you for letting us camp on your land." "Thank you for the repairs," she replied. Then, with a hesitation that suggested she wasn't used to asking favors, "If you return to Helena, if you happen to hear anything of James—" "I'll send word," Sam promised, though he suspected there would be no news to send. He rejoined the drive, and as they pulled away, he looked back. Sarah stood in her doorway, watching them go, a solitary figure against the vast emptiness of the prairie. The image stayed with him as they continued toward Helena. There was something both heartbreaking and admirable about her steadfast belief. Sam had known too many men who abandoned responsibilities, wives, and children to hold much hope for James Vance's return. But Sarah's faith was unwavering, and that gave him pause. The drive reached Helena without further incident. The cattle were delivered to Crawford's buyer, the men were paid, and most headed straight for the saloons to spend their earnings. Sam, however, found himself in the land office asking after records of mining claims filed by a James Vance. The clerk, an older man with spectacles perched on his nose, searched through his ledgers. Vance, yes, here it is. Filed a claim in 73 up near Orofino Gulch." "Is it still active?" Sam asked. The clerk ran a finger down the page. "No, marked as abandoned in 74, taxes unpaid." He peered up at Sam. "You looking to buy it?" "No, just curious about the man." Sam hesitated, then asked, "Any record of what became of him?" The clerk shook his head. "Not my department. You might check with the sheriff if you think there was foul play. Otherwise, people come and go all the time. He probably moved on to the next strike. Sam thanked him and left. His suspicions confirmed. James Vance had abandoned his claim and, it seemed, his wife over 2 years ago. He spent the next day making inquiries around Helena. A bartender at the Golden Nugget recalled a red-headed miner named Vance, who had been a regular until he'd struck a modest vein of gold and disappeared shortly after. The barber remembered him too, said he'd come in for a shave and a haircut, talking about heading to California with his newfound wealth. No one mentioned a wife waiting back home. Sam could have left it at that, collected his pay, and moved on to the next job. But the image of Sarah standing in that doorway, her eyes scanning the horizon for a man who would never return, haunted him. He found Jenkins at the Cattleman's Rest, a favorite haunt of trail bosses and ranchers. "Need another job," Sam said without preamble. Jenkins looked up from his whiskey. "Crawford was pleased with the drive, said he'd hire you again come fall. I'm thinking of something sooner. You know anyone driving south?" Jenkins studied him. "This about that widow?" Sam didn't deny it. "She deserves to know the truth," the trail boss sighed. "Mitchell's taking a small herd down to Cheyenne next week. Could probably use an extra hand." "Appreciate it," Sam said, and left Jenkins to his drink. A week later, Sam was riding south with Mitchell's outfit, 20 head of prime breeding stock bound for a ranch near Cheyenne. It was a smaller operation than Crawford's, with just 4 men including Sam, but the pace was easier and the pay fair. As they neared Sarah's homestead, Sam felt a growing apprehension. The truth he carried would break her heart, shatter the hope she'd held on to for 3 long years. Part of him wondered if it would be kinder to let her continue believing, to keep her vigil with her faith intact. But a deeper part knew that true kindness lay in honesty, however painful. Sarah Vance had spent 3 years of her life waiting for a man who had chosen to leave her behind. She deserved the chance to make a new life with that knowledge, rather than wasting more years on a false hope. They passed the turnoff to her property around midday. "Need to make a stop," Sam told Mitchell. "Personal business. I'll catch up before nightfall." Mitchell, a taciturn man who asked few questions, merely nodded and continued with the herd. Sam turned Buck toward the now familiar homestead. As he approached, he saw Sarah in her garden, bent over the rows of vegetables. She straightened when she heard hoofbeats, her hand going to shield her eyes from the sun. For a moment, he saw hope flare in her expression, the instinctive response of a woman who still expected, every time, to see her husband returning. Then, recognition dawned, and while she didn't appear disappointed to see Sam, the brief light of anticipation faded. "Mr. Dawson," she called as he dismounted, "this is a surprise." "Miss Sarah," he greeted her, removing his hat. "I was passing through with Mitchell's drive, thought I'd stop by." She brushed the soil from her hands. "You're welcome to water your horse. Are you hungry? I was about to prepare lunch." "That's kind of you," Sam said, following her toward the cabin. Inside, the home was immaculate, every surface polished and dust-free. It spoke of hours spent in domestic tasks, perhaps to fill the endless time of waiting. Sarah moved with efficiency in the small space, placing bread, cheese, and dried fruit on the table. "Did you just return from Helena?" she asked, the question casual, but her eyes intent. Sam sat at the table, gathering his resolve. "Yes, madam. That's partly why I'm here." She paused in her preparations, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. "You found something. About James." He nodded slowly. "I made some inquiries. Your husband filed a claim in Orofino Gulch in '73. Sarah sat down across from him. "And?" "The claim was abandoned in '74, taxes unpaid." He watched her carefully as he continued. "I spoke to people who remembered him. He found gold, Miss Sarah. Not a fortune, but enough." Her face remained composed, but her hands, folded neatly on the table, tightened until her knuckles were white. "Where is he now?" "The last anyone knew, he was headed to California. That was 2 years ago." Sam hesitated, then added gently, "There was no mention of plans to return here." Sarah was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, though barely above a whisper. I knew, I think. Somewhere deep inside, I knew he wasn't coming back, but admitting it felt like betraying him somehow, as if my doubt would be the thing that kept him away. "I'm sorry," Sam said, and meant it. "I thought you should know the truth." She nodded, a single tear tracking down her cheek. "Thank you for taking the time to find out, for telling me." She wiped the tear away with a quick, almost angry gesture. 3 years. 3 years of my life, waiting at that door. They ate in silence, the food tasteless to Sam as he watched Sarah process her grief. It wasn't the shock of a new widow, but the resigned sorrow of a woman whose suspicions had finally been confirmed. After the meal, she walked with him to where Buck was tethered. "What will you do now?" Sam asked. Sarah looked back at the homestead, at the door she had kept faithful watch over for so long. "I don't know. This place, we built it together, dreamed of filling it with children, but it's just land and lumber without those dreams. You could sell? Start fresh somewhere else?" "Perhaps." She turned back to him. "And you, Mr. Dawson? Where does your path lead after Cheyenne?" "Haven't decided yet. There's always work for a man who can ride and rope." A sudden resolve seemed to straighten her shoulders. "Would you do me one more kindness when you return to Helena?" "Of course. There's a letter in the house. I'll get it." She hurried inside and returned with an envelope. "If you could deliver this to the land office, it formally relinquishes any claim I might have to James's mining stake. I want no part of the gold that made him forget his promises." Sam took the envelope, tucking it securely in his vest. "I'll see it delivered." "Thank you." She extended her hand and he took it, surprised by the strength in her grip. "Safe travels, Mr. Dawson." He mounted Buck and tipped his hat to her. "Miss Sarah." As he rode away, he looked back once. Sarah stood by her garden, no longer in the doorway, watching him go. It was a small change, but significant. Sam caught up with Mitchell's drive before sundown, as promised. The cattle journey to Cheyenne was uneventful, and upon completion, Sam collected his pay and prepared to head north again. He had no particular reason to return to Helena, except for Sarah's letter and a nagging sense of unfinished business. He took his time on the journey back, stopping to work for a week at a ranch that needed help with spring branding. The days were long and the work hard, but it gave him time to think about Sarah Vance and the uncertain future she faced. By the time he reached her homestead again, nearly a month had passed. The garden had grown lush in his absence, and there were new curtains in the windows. But the most notable change was Sarah herself. She was outside, mending a section of fence he hadn't gotten to during his previous visit, her movements sure and purposeful. She looked up at his approach. Surprise quickly replaced by a smile that transformed her face. "Mr. Dawson, back so soon?" "Passing through," he said, dismounting. "Thought I'd check on you." "As you can see, I've been busy." She gestured to the fence. "Turns out I'm quite capable with a hammer." "So I see." He moved to inspect her work, which was indeed well done. "You seem different." "I am." She put down her tools. "I've made some decisions. I'm keeping the homestead, at least for now. It's mine as much as it was his, more so, now that I've been the one maintaining it." "It's good land," Sam agreed. "Yes, but it's too much for one person." She looked at him directly. "I've hired help. 2 local boys and their sister come 3 days a week. We're planting more crops and I've bought some chickens." Sam smiled at the determination in her voice. "Sounds like you have things well in hand." "I'm learning too," she said. "Would you like some coffee? Or are you in a hurry to reach Helena?" "Coffee would be welcome." Inside the cabin, more changes were evident. The furniture had been rearranged and James's chair no longer sat empty across from hers, but had been moved to a corner, replaced by a small writing desk. "I've been corresponding with a publisher in Denver," Sarah explained, following his gaze. "They're interested in stories of frontier life from a woman's perspective." "You're a writer?" She poured the coffee. "I've kept a journal since I was a girl. James used to tease me about it." A shadow passed over her face at the mention of her husband, but it didn't linger as it might have before. "It seems there's an appetite back east for for tales of the West, particularly from those who live it. "I'd say you've lived enough for a story or two," Sam commented. Sarah's laugh was unexpected and bright. "Indeed, though perhaps not the one I thought I was living." She sat across from him. "Did you deliver my letter?" "I did. The clerk said the claim had already been sold to another prospector, but he'll keep the letter on file should any questions arise." She nodded, satisfied. "Good. That chapter's closed then." They talked until the coffee was gone, Sarah asking about his travels and sharing her plans for the homestead. There was an ease between them that hadn't been there before, the barrier of her waiting now removed. As Sam prepared to leave, Sarah walked him to Buck. "Will you be staying in Helena long?" "Not sure yet. Might winter there if the right work comes along." She hesitated, then said, "If you find yourself passing this way again, you'd be welcome to stop. The door's always open." The choice of words wasn't lost on Sam. "I'd like that." He rode north with the image of Sarah Vance in his mind, not standing in a doorway with eyes fixed on the horizon, but working her land, building a life of her own making. In Helena, Sam found steady work with Crawford's outfit, breaking horses and helping prepare for the fall drives. The town continued to grow, the rough edges of the mining camp gradually giving way to the trappings of civilization, a proper courthouse, a school, even a small theater. He thought often of Sarah and found himself plotting routes that would take him near her homestead, creating reasons to ride south. By summer's end, he had visited 3 more times, each visit longer than the last, each departure more reluctant. On his 4th visit in early September, he arrived to find Sarah directing a small crew of workers who were raising a new barn to replace the aging structure on her property. "Mr. Dawson," she called, waving him over, "your timing is excellent. We could use another pair of strong hands." Sam spent the day helping with the barn raising, working alongside Sarah and her neighbors. The communal effort reminded him of his childhood in Pennsylvania, before the restlessness had taken hold of him and driven him west. That evening, after the neighbors had gone and they sat on her porch watching the sunset, Sarah turned to him. "You've ridden a long way from Helena just to help with a barn." "Seemed worth the journey," he replied. She studied him in the fading light. "Why do you keep coming back, Samuel?" It was the first time she had used his given name, and it stirred something in him. "Maybe I'm tired of riding away." "You've been riding away your whole life, from what you've told me." "Yes." He met her gaze steadily. "But I've never before found something I wanted to ride toward." Sarah's breath caught. "And now? Now I find myself thinking about a homestead with good land and a strong woman who doesn't wait in doorways anymore." A slow smile spread across her face. "Is that a declaration, Mr. Dawson?" "It could be," he said, suddenly uncertain. "If it's welcome." She reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and sure. "It is." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell. Their linked hands a promise neither needed to put into words just yet. Sam stayed for 3 days, helping to complete the barn and make other repairs around the property. When it came time to leave, he found it harder than ever. "I need to return to Helena," he explained as they stood by Buck. "I gave Crawford my word I'd stay through the fall drive." "I understand," Sarah said. "Promises should be kept." "But after that?" He took her hands in his. "After that, I'd like to come back, not just to visit. To stay." Her voice held hope, but caution too. "Yes, if you'll have me." She squeezed his hands. "I will be here, Samuel, not waiting in the doorway, but working the land, building something worth returning to." "I won't make you wait long," he promised. The fall drive was the hardest work Sam had ever done, not because of the physical demands, which were considerable, but because each day took him further from Sarah. The cattle moved at their maddeningly slow pace through mountain passes and across valleys, the journey stretching into weeks. When they finally returned to Helena in early November, the first snows had already dusted the mountains. Crawford, pleased with the successful drive, offered Sam a permanent position for the next year with increased pay and responsibilities. "I appreciate the offer," Sam told him, "but I've decided to settle down. Got a place in mind south of here." Crawford raised an eyebrow. "Wouldn't happen to be near a certain homestead we passed last spring." Sam smiled. "It might." "Well, can't say I'm surprised. When a man finds good land and a good woman, he'd be a fool to keep wandering." Crawford clapped him on the shoulder. "You're welcome back any time the homesteading life gets too quiet." Sam used his earnings to purchase supplies, seeds for spring planting, tools, materials for the improvements he envisioned for Sarah's soon-to-be-their home. He also bought a ring, a simple gold band that nonetheless represented the most significant investment he'd ever made. The journey south was slowed by the weather, early winter storms making the trails treacherous, but Sam pushed on, driven by the promise of what awaited him. He arrived at Sarah's homestead on a clear, cold December day. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the new barn stood proud against the skyline. But what caught his attention was Sarah herself, not in the doorway, but out in the yard, chopping wood with sure, strong strokes. She looked up at the sound of his horse, her face breaking into a radiant smile when she saw him. Dropping the axe, she ran to meet him as he dismounted. "You came back," she said, breathless, not from the run, but from joy. "I said I would." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "And I never break a promise." That evening, after a meal shared at the table they would now share for all their days, Sam took the ring from his pocket. "Sarah Vance, I'm not a man of many words or grand gestures. I've been a wanderer all my life, never staying long enough to put down roots. But with you, I've found where I belong." He held out the ring. "Will you marry me?" Sarah took the ring, sliding it onto her finger. "Yes, Samuel Dawson, I will." They were married by the circuit preacher when he passed through in January. The ceremony, small but joyful, attended by their neighbors and even Jenkins and Crawford, who made the journey down from Helena. As spring arrived, they worked side by side to expand the garden, repair fences, and plan for the future. The homestead flourished under their joint care, and Sarah's writings began to appear in newspapers and magazines back east, bringing in additional income and satisfaction. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a ritual they had come to cherish, Sarah leaned against Sam's shoulder. "I used to stand in that doorway for hours," she said softly, "watching and waiting, letting life pass me by." "And now?" Sam asked, his arm around her waist. She placed his hand over her stomach, where the first subtle roundness had begun to show. "Now I'm living it." The look of wonder that spread across Sam's face was worth all the years of waiting, all the heartache that had led to this moment. "A child," he whispered, awe in his voice. "Our child." "The first of many, I hope," Sarah said, laughing as he pulled her close. "The door will always be open," Sam promised, "but we won't spend our lives waiting in it. We'll be too busy living." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and purple, Sarah thought of the words Sam had said to her when he first learned of her vigil. "You'll never wait again." At the time, she had taken it as a prediction that James would return. Now she understood it as a promise from a man who knew the value of presence over absence, of action over anticipation. She had waited at the door for someone who never returned. But in doing so, she had been there when the man who would never leave her rode into her life. Their first child, a son they named William, was born the following winter, his lusty cries filling the cabin with new life and purpose. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Emily, whose curious nature and quick mind reminded Sam of her mother. The homestead grew as their family did, with additional rooms added to the cabin, more land cultivated, and a small herd of cattle established. Sarah's writings gained popularity, her honest depictions of frontier life resonating with readers across the country. In 1882, 6 years after Sam first rode onto her land, Sarah received a letter forwarded from Helena. The postmark was San Francisco, and the handwriting, though she hadn't seen it in years, was unmistakably James's. With trembling hands, she opened it, Sam at her side. "My dear Sarah," it began, "I do not write seeking forgiveness, for I deserve none. I write only to express my regret for the pain I must have caused you, and to let you know that I am well, and hope you are too. I have heard of your success as a writer, and am glad that you have found your voice. I hope, too, that you have found happiness. With sincere regards, James Vance." Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. "After all this time," she murmured. "Are you all right?" Sam asked, concern in his eyes. She looked at him, at the life they had built together, at their children playing in the yard, visible through the open door. "Yes," she said firmly, "I'm more than all right." That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah added the letter to the cedar box where she had once kept James's correspondence. But now the box held other treasures as well. Her first published story, William's first tooth, a lock of Emily's hair, the pressed wildflower Sam had given her on their wedding day. "You kept it," Sam said, nodding to the box as she returned it to its shelf. "It's part of our story," Sarah explained. "All of it, the waiting, the leaving, the finding. I wouldn't change any of it because it led us here." "To a door that's open, but that no one's waiting in," Sam said, drawing her into his arms. "Exactly." She kissed him, feeling the familiar warmth of his embrace. "Though I will always be glad when you walk through it." And as they retired to their bedroom, the door to their home remained open to the cool summer night, not as a vigil for someone who would never return, but as a welcome to the life they continued to build together, day by day, in the heart of the Wild West they both loved. Over the years, the Dawson homestead became known throughout the territory for its hospitality and prosperity. Travelers passing through could count on a hot meal and a place to rest, and many remarked on the warmth they felt upon entering the home. Sarah's writing career flourished, her collections of frontier stories and observations eventually published as books that found their way into homes across America. Sam's knowledge of cattle and horses made their small ranch a successful enterprise, and their children grew strong and capable in the tradition of frontier families. In 1892, when Wyoming had been a state for 2 years, Sarah stood on their porch, now expanded and wrapped around 2 sides of the house that had grown with their family. A stagecoach approached, bringing their oldest son William home from his first semester at college in Denver. Sam joined her, his hair now streaked with silver, but his eyes still bright with the same quiet strength that had first drawn her to him. "Remember when you used to stand in that old doorway watching for a ghost?" he asked, slipping his arm around her waist. Sarah leaned into his embrace. "I remember a cowboy who told me I'd never wait again." "Best promise I ever made," he said as William jumped down from the stage, followed by a surprise visitor, their daughter Emily, home early from her teaching position in Cheyenne. As their children approached, Sarah's heart swelled with a joy that had only deepened over the years. She had once waited at a door, her life suspended in the anticipation of a return that never came. Now, surrounded by the family she and Sam had created, she knew that the true blessing lay not in waiting, but in moving forward through open doors and into the fullness of a life well lived. "No more waiting," she agreed, taking Sam's hand as they walked down the steps to greet their children. "Just living." And that, Sarah knew, was the greatest adventure of all.